Hey guys, Matthew here. A couple days ago, I made a video in regards to what I think is one of the best league starters for the upcoming 3.20 league, which has a POB where there are a lot of different items. So in today's video, I'm basically going to be giving you guys a step-by-step guide on how to craft every single one of the items in the POB. So this may be a little bit of a longer video, so I highly recommend if you are interested in a specific item, check out the timestamps below so that you can see exactly what you want. But let's get right into it. So we're going to start off with essentially like the default setup. And that is basically going to be with your tree. I believe the first time we're going to be putting a cluster is level 75. So we're going to start with the cluster, and then after that, we're going to go to the items. So the first cluster is going to be Haunting Shout and Led by Example. Now, as I explain these, I'm going to go ahead and basically showcase them step by step on Craft of Exile. So we're going to go Jewels, and we're going to go, I'm blind or what? No, it should be Cluster or something. Cluster? Okay, there we go. Medium Cluster, and then it is going to be Exerted Effect. So, Haunting Shout led by example is actually one of the easiest things to craft because first off, it requires only item level 50 on the cluster for Haunting Shout and item level 1 for led by example. And the weightings are actually some of the highest weighting modifiers. So because led by example is significantly, like it's basically twice as common as Haunting Shout, what I would personally recommend is to alteration spam for Haunting Shout. And you'll see that this is extremely easy, right? 17 alterations on average and 5 augments. And then go ahead and augment it and then hit a regal for so I think what I can do is led by example, and I think I can do like fractured. So let's just say we had, because I'm not sure if it's going to work otherwise. Say we had led by example, or sorry, not led by example, Haunting Shout from the alteration spamming. Whenever we go ahead and hit it with a regal, the odds of getting led by example is 16 attempts, right? So for the most part, it should be pretty easy to get this done, for given the fact that regals are extremely cheap on League Start and alterations also extremely cheap. I think that you can probably get this cluster for like 10 chaos or so. Now that's if you don't honestly just buy one that already has Haunting Shadow led by example, because they're very common, because as I said, they're two of the most common modifiers. But yeah, that's essentially going to be your starting point. Now, it doesn't mean that, let's say you're alteration spamming and you hit led by example, that you can't do the opposite, right? And instead go for Haunting Shout on the Regal. However, you can see it's going to be twice as hard because the weightings are twice as bad, and because alterations are typically much cheaper than Regals, like significantly cheaper, like 17 alterations is probably like a chaos or so in the first day of a league. So that's what I would do. I would alteration spam for a Haunting Shout, and then I would regal for led by example. And the cool thing is, you can look at it and be like, okay, so it's 17 regals. That's quite a lot, right? But the reality is, let's say you get mob mentality on the regal because you're using an item level 50, item level 75 cluster. Well, that led by example and mob mentality is actually a cluster you're going to need much later on, which is worth a lot more currency. So essentially, you're going for the low hanging fruit of what you actually want. But if you get, say, warning call or mob mentality or even provocateur alongside your haunting shout, these are all going to be worth a good chunk of currency compared to the led by example one. So you can actually make money as you're going through this. So that's pretty good. All right, next we are basically going to be still using Haunting Shout led by example, but the next cluster that we're going to be interested in is a large cluster. So this one is going to be a little bit different here. So we're going to look at a large cluster for physical damage. And the thing about this one here, where is it? Okay, physical damage. The thing about this one is that there's basically only one way that I think is the proper way to craft these clusters, and that is, well, I guess two ways. Jagged fossil spamming or physical reforges from harvest. That's it. Because battle hardened is what you want, and it's physical tagged. And it also has like the evasion and the armor, which is really good for the armor. Then we want master fundamental for the all res, but also for the physical damage. And then we also want another one, which is tagged as physical, which is a suffix, which is furious assault, right, for the attack speed. Now, the thing is, when you're crafting these, let's say that instead of getting battle hardened, you get like iron breaker, and instead of getting furious assault, you get force multiplier. there's always the opportunity to sell them because the bases are typically not too expensive. So you can actually basically sell your failures for a profit. Um, Especially say you get Battle Hardened, Master of Fundamentals, and Force Multiplier. That's actually twice as hard than to get Furious Assault, so they're typically worth significantly more because Force Multiplier gives us double damage, which is a big deal. It's by far the best notable on physical clusters. But for General Cry specifically, since it uses Paradoxica, which gives it double damage, they don't stack, right? You can't get double damage and then more double damage. So that's why we don't care for Force Multiplier. But if you do get it while crafting, it's actually a profitable thing to sell, especially if you have Battle Hardened Fundamentals and Force Multiplier. That's an amazing setup. But what you're going for is Furious Assault. We need the attack speed to get to 10 attacks per second, which is where we're going to get 6 stages and release on the Blade Flurry to really max out our damage. But yeah, that's the only way to really craft these. Either you jagged spam or you do physical reforges on Harvest. All right, next we're gonna go to the next one. So again, Battle Hardened, First Assault, Master of Fundamentals, and then we have Haunting Shout led by example. But then we are adding a new one, which is Mob Mentality and Warning Call. Now, Mob Mentality and Warning Call is actually one of the hardest clusters to craft for this build because the weightings are so very small. So if we go back to our medium clusters with exerted attacks, you'll see that Mob Mentality has a weighting of 100, which is significantly rarer than, say, Haunting Shower led by example. And Warning Call has a weighting of 300, which is also significantly rarer than the other two. So what I would do when crafting this cluster, specifically the Mob Mentality Warning Call, is I would Alteration Spam for Mob Mentality, and then I would Regal for any of Haunting Shout, Led by Example, or Warning Call. And then as long as I get any of those three, I'm basically going to keep that. And instead what I'll do is I'll make a new one where I'm going to Alteration Spam for Warning Call instead, and then I'm going to Regal for any of the other ones. And if you ever do end up with Warning Call Mob Mentality, I would personally sell it because they're worth a ton of currency. And instead, I would just make another one until I get the modifier that I'm missing. So, led by example is the most common one. So what I would do is I would Alteration Spam for, say, Mob Mentality. Let's say I Regal led by example. I'm happy about that. Then I'm going to go ahead and make another one. I'm going to alt spam for Warning Call. And let's say I Regal led by example. I would look at, well, can I just sell that for a profit and then do it again? And if it does have a decent margin of profit, I would sell it. Otherwise, I would re-Alteration Spam for Warning Call. And then I would try to Regal again for Haunting Shout, right? And you could basically do this again and again. And if it's a profitable thing to even sell the failures with, say, led by example, then you can basically do this infinitely, which is really good. And if you ever do happen to hit Mob Mentality on the Regal, that's a ton of currency that you're going to get through that, because those are worth like a lot. All right, so that's pretty much that. I think there's nothing else that changes in terms of the clusters. We're basically rocking a large and 2 of the mediums. Basically, what's important is that you get these four nodes all together, but which one is on which cluster is essentially what doesn't matter. All right, next, what's going to happen by level 95 is that we're going to add a new large cluster, but it's going to be the exact same thing: Battle Hardened, Furious Assault, and Master of Fundamentals. So I don't have to explain how that works. And however, what happens is by level 95, when we get to the actual endgame setup, we're going to get Awakened Gems. Once we get Awakened Gems, we no longer need, I think it's Haunting Shout for Intimidate or something like that. Yeah, I think it's Haunting Shout for Intimidate, because we're going to get Intimidate on one of the Awakened Gems. I think it's Awakened Melee Fizz. So because we no longer need Haunting Shout, we can basically go back to doing the exact same thing. But at that point, what we want is Led by Example for the Onslaught, Provocateur, and that's what's going to be there instead of the Intimidate. And Provocateur is going to give us 40% crit chance and 10 crit multi, which is really nice for this build. You can see that, let's see here. So if I go Endgame and I go Endgame, this cluster right here, or this node right there, Provocateur, is 6% more damage. So it is a lot of damage, and I highly recommend getting it. But essentially, the crafting of the cluster is going to be the exact same thing. You want, at that point, you want Mob Mentality, Warning Call, Provocateur, and Led by Example. And the combination of where they are on which cluster doesn't matter as long as you have all 4. And that's pretty much it for the cluster jewel crafting. Nothing else is going to change from there on. Now let's go ahead and have a look at the actual gear. From the default setup, there's actually nothing that's crafted. You can see I basically just put life on the items and that's it. Essentially, what you're going to need to do is just grab whatever is missing, right? So let's say you're missing some resistances, you know, some attributes, because if we go to the default setup, when you swap to Ichimonji, you can see that you're missing like 80 dexterity. Obviously your resistances are non-existent. So that's where you're going to go ahead and put that on, which is why I didn't craft anything, didn't put crafted gear, because for the most part, you're just going to use whatever you can either find on the ground or buy from other players. That's actually going to be the same thing. Even when we start using Paradoxica, we're still going to be using very generic gear. So, you know, there's nothing on any of these. What's important is going to be the bench crafts, of course, especially for the jewelry, so that we can fix our mana problems. Once we move away from the Praxis. Praxis is actually going to carry you all the way through until you get access to the Elrion jewelry. So that should be anywhere between the second day, the end of the first day, like the end of the Friday, or maybe like Saturday, depending on if you're trying to self-farm the jewelry or if you're going to use like a community crafting service where you pay a little bit of a fee, but you can get it earlier. That's going to be up to you. All right. Next setup is Paradoxical with Athnats. Again, there's nothing crafted here. It really goes down to the end game where the crafting begins. And the reason why the crafting starts on the end game setup is because, for the most part, once you actually swap into crafted gear, you'll kind of want to swap into all the crafted gear at the same time, if that makes sense. And what I mean by that is that when you're using the non-crafted gear, right, just the regular life res like attribute type of gear, there's very little that you can do in terms of individual upgrades that are going to matter that much. While once you go on to the actual endgame setup, a lot of these things sort of go hand in hand together. Like, for example, the rings, right? Well, the reason why we want to invest into these rings is because they're synthesized avoid ailments rings. And in order to get complete ailment of immunity, we're going to need ailment immunity on the rings implicit, on the body armor, and on the boots. Like, let's say, for example, you had ailment immunity on your body armor, but not on the rings and not on the boots. There's no point, right? So that's why I'm saying, like, it's sort of like a package deal to where, in terms of the end game setup, you'll really want to go and do everything at once, right? And that's also when a lot of the cost is going to come. Like, pretty much everything that you see on the PoB up to the end game setup is very, very cheap. Paradoxica can be a little bit expensive, depends on the meta for sure. But Red Blade Banner is typically not too expensive. Abyssus is really cheap. Asnat's Gentle Touch, ever since they added a bunch of different divination cards for it or whatever, not too expensive. Same thing for Reislotha. Used to be super expensive, but it's not anymore. So a lot of this stuff is really cheap. But once we get into the endgame setup, that's where the price really jumps up. We're going into awakened items. We're going into elevated items. We're going into fractured crafting and whatnot, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about right now. So I'm going to start off by first explaining the Astral Plate. It's a very simple craft. You're essentially just going to start off with 2 elevated suffixes, one being the elevated all res, because it comes with +1 max res, which is really nice, and the other elevated is going to be the attack crit. Now, you don't need to elevate the attack crit, but if you're going to spend the Awakener's Orb and also spend the elevated all res, because regular non-elevated all res is like honestly not worth it, might as well elevate both, right? So that's what we're gonna do. So let's start off with the Astral Plate. So what we're gonna do here, and I'm basically gonna go step by step, is first off talk about how we're gonna go about getting the elevated all res. Then I'll do the elevated attack crit, and then we're basically going to go with the rest of the craft, because there are basically multiple steps. So we're going to go to the emulator, craft a new item. It's going to be a body armor, strength, astral plate. It's typically what I would go for because of the all res implicit. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with the all res. Now, which one you go for doesn't really matter. Like, which one of the influences you're getting on your astral plate is not that big of a deal. But I'm just going to go ahead and start with the Astral Plate, and we're going to go with a Warlord Astral Plate. And what we're going to do is we are going to look for the suffix Allres that is from Warlord. And as you can see, the suffix of Allres doesn't have a tag. So what we're going to do is we're going to alteration spam for T1 Allres. Now, once we get this, we are basically going to craft on the bench. Suffixes cannot be changed, which is going to be a prefix, and this is going to be 2 divines. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So suffixes cannot be changed. And then we are going to imprint this so that we never have to waste the two divines again, and that we don't have to worry about any of that. So this is basically going to create a save state. We can always go back to this exact state, so we don't have to get to this step again. And then once we have that, we're essentially going to look at what can we reforge to guarantee that we can basically go for an elevation. And for us, that's going to be attack. Because if you look on a body armor, there is no prefixes whatsoever that have the attack tags. Physical has this one, which is a non-influence, and then the warlord has physical for sure. But again, because there is a non-physical tag, we don't want to do this. So because we are no longer able to reforge non-rare items, unfortunately, that's a pretty annoying change in my mind. What we're going to need to do first from this step is to regal it. Now, whatever we regal doesn't really matter. Can be a prefix, can be a suffix. In the end, it doesn't matter because we are going to be reforging it and then Awakener orbing it. So, like, you could look at this and be like, oh, wow, we got T1 cold res. That's really nice. But it doesn't matter because that T1 cold res is not going to remain. All right, and then we're going to go ahead and reforge our attack, which is going to guarantee socketed attacks. So go ahead and do that. Reforge attack. That's going to guarantee this socketed minus 15. And then what we're going to do is simply go for a Maven Orb or an Orb of Dominance, right? Because this is going to elevate one of the modifiers. And there are some cases where a failed elevation can be salvaged by selling it, but that sort of depends on the meta. So let's say I did this, right? Now I got my elevated res. I'm basically good to go. I can keep going with the craft. But let's say I actually elevated the minus mana cost. If there is a demand of any kind due to the meta for this modifier, you can actually sell it at break even, or in some cases, even at a profit. But in most cases, unfortunately, that's just going to be a redo. So you're going to go ahead and imprint back. It's going to take you all the way back here so that all you have to do is imprint again. And then once again, regal, and then reforge attack. That's going to once again put you at this exact same state. Did I regal T1 cold res again? That's crazy. And then we're going to Orb of Dominance it. And you do this until you end up with your elevated all res. Now that's basically the first step. The next one is going to be the attacks have percent critical strike chance. So we're going to go ahead and restart this. Create a new item, body armor, strength, astral plate. Now the base won't matter as long as you have one that's an astral plate, obviously. So we're going to go with a hunter chest. And then the easiest way is going to be to reforge crit from harvest in order to get this. So we can just do basically crit reforges until we get T1 attacks have percent critical strike chance and one other modifier that is basically going to be a hunter's modifier. So in this case, we actually got the attack crit and the spell crit. Now this is best case scenario. The reason why this is best case scenario is that because there's no other influence modifiers, right? There's basically the hunter attack crit and the hunter spell crit, and they're both T1. And by the way, this is really rare. Don't expect this to happen very often. Once we actually dominance it, it's either going to elevate the spell crit or it's going to elevate the attack crit. And in both cases, we basically win because it's one of those cases where both of those are going to be in demand, at least to some extent. So whatever one you actually end up elevating, if you elevate your attack crit, that's good because you're essentially going to be happy with the craft. But if you elevate the spell crit, that's actually also perfectly fine because from there on, you could basically just sell that and go again. Which can either basically break even or net you some pretty decent profit. It sort of depends on, again, the meta and the demand for the other one. But that's essentially what we would do. Now, once we actually have both items, right? So once we have our body armor with the elevated attack crit and the other one with the elevated all res, since those are both suffixes, as long as there's no other influence modifier on each, when we Awakener's Orb, we're going to be guaranteed to get both affixes. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to go Warlord Hunter. And then we're going to go ahead and add our suffixes of attack crit, which is going to be elevated, and also our +1 max res elevated. Now, the rest of the craft, whenever you Awakener's Orb, it doesn't matter, right? It would be nice, sure, if you had like another good suffix, like, I don't know, chaos resistance or like physical damage reduction, sure. But you have absolutely no control over that, so I'm just going to add a random suffix. Hopefully, you also have an open prefix. If you don't have an open prefix, you're unfortunately going to have to annul to open a prefix because they removed Reforge keeping suffixes, which is another thing that's super annoying about the changes to harvest in last league. But that's essentially what we're going to need to do. So if you have 3 prefixes, go for the annul. If you brick your suffixes, then just blame GGG. Nothing I can do about it. But if you have an open prefix, that's all you need because we're going to go ahead and craft on suffixes cannot be changed. And then we're going to reforge caster. The only thing that can happen when we reforge caster at this point is to get +1 curse, right? That's literally the only thing that can happen. And the reason for that, oh my god. The reason for that is because there's no other caster modifier whatsoever. If you have an open suffix, however, it could give you spell critical strike chance. But for the most part, you're probably not going to have an open suffix. But if you do, just know that that is a possibility. But yeah, what we're going for is the additional curse. Now, once you get the additional curse, you've essentially got 2 choices. You can go for I guess you could say, cheaper version of the craft, and you can go for a more expensive version of the craft. And the only real difference there is going to be whether you absolutely want life or not on your chess piece. So what you do is once you have your additional curse, we're just going to assume that it came with nothing else because most of the time it's going to come with no other modifier. It's just going to come with the additional curse and nothing else. Of course, if you have full prefixes at this point, you can either decide to try to go for an annul, use it for the time being. It's going to be up to you because Reforge keeping suffixes no longer exist. So yeah, we have additional curse. We have 2 open prefixes. We are once again going to do suffixes cannot be changed, and then we're going to go for an ashling. Now, this has a 50% chance of hitting the suffixes cannot be changed. That's what we want, or 50% chance of hitting the additional curse. We're going to hope that it keeps the additional curse and gives us a veiled prefix. Perfect. That's exactly what we want to happen. Next, we're going to craft a block on the bench, and this block is going to be either block attack damage or block spell damage. They have the same weighting. And then when we unveil, the idea is that there's 2 things that we want. We want either % life and mana, or we want the avoid elemental ailments. In both cases, it's a win. So here we got avoid elements. Nice. And then we could basically finish off the craft by simply crafting on the % life and mana from the bench. And that would be the entirety of our craft done. And if you go to the PoB, that's exactly what you see, right? Elevated all res, elevated attack script, +1 curse. Then in this case, I have the life and mana as the unveil, I believe. And then I have crafted the avoid ailments. Now, avoid ailments goes up to, I believe, 25%. And then these 2 rings, the implicits, go up to 25% each. So you don't need to unveil the avoid ailments to completely cap out your ailment immunity on this build. Just the benchcraft is going to be enough. Matter of fact, if you really wanted to go budget, you could actually cap out your ailment immunity from just the boots and the 2 rings, and you do not need to get any avoidance on your body armor. However, this is going to require you to get avoidance, elemental ailment avoidance on your boots from the essence and also from the implicit, because you can get more than 50% total, and then the rest of the other 50% can come from your rings. So let me go ahead and show you that real quick. PoEDB, can't type. So if you head over to PoEDB and you go to boots, you can see that avoid elemental ailments from the essence. Even if you were to use a T2, avoid elemental ailments goes up to 30%. So you only need 20% on your implicit to be completely immune to elemental ailments. And then I don't remember if it's this one. Chance to avoid being elemental ailment. Okay. I guess it's going to be the Eater of Worlds one. Alright. Chance to avoid elemental ailments. As you can see, all you would need is a T2 roll to be completely ailment avoidance immune, right? From T2 essence plus T2 this plus the rings, and you're done. So you don't even need it on your chest. What that means is that if you were to unveil the % life and mana, you can actually craft life, and then you would have both the life and the % life and mana. So that would be a little bit more defensive. However, you would need to give up your your I think it's general cry cooldown recovery rate on your boots. Let me just verify that. Yeah, you would need to give up the general cry cooldown recovery rate, and that is somewhat important because the general cry cooldown recovery rate on the boots allow us to no longer need to get natural authority on the tree. So that's sort of up to you essentially, based on maybe like your budget, right? Because if you don't need to go for the unveil, what you can do on the body armor, which can drastically, obviously, decrease the cost, is just reforge for the curse with reforge caster, and then just craft on life, and then you can completely forget about it. But you would be losing a decent bit of damage because we're, essentially what this allows us to do, not getting natural authority by the end game setup, is it allows us to put another cluster in the build, and another cluster is another 10-15% damage or something like that. So it's a pretty big deal. But that's going to be up to you. That's essentially it for the body armor, how to craft it step by step. Next, we're going to have a look at the boots. Now, the boots, I really don't need to go step by step too much because it's super, super easy. You're basically going to look for a pair of boots with a fractured modifier of your choice for the suffix. Now, that could be either resistance or it could also be dexterity. Those are the two choices that I would go for. Dexterity is very, very important on this build, and if you don't have it on your boots, you're going to need it on your amulet. And if you don't want it on your amulet, you're going to need it on your boots, right? So that's up to you. Now, if you want the best possible bases, you're going to want a pure strength base for armor. And in this case, you're not going to be able to get dexterity. Unless, of course, you force it via an essence, which is perfectly fine as well. Or sorry, yeah, you can't do that because of the avoid element requirement. So yeah, it's probably a resistance is what I would go for. So let's go ahead and head over to Craft of Exile, and then we're once again going to restart this. It's going to be very, very simple for the boots. We're going to go, say, Strength for the best possible base. Probably going to be Titan Greaves. And then no influence because we're going to go Eldritch and Redeemer. Or sorry, Eldritch Implicits. So once we have our pair of boots, we are going to go for a fractured suffix of our choice. Now, I would probably go for Chaos Res, but if it's too expensive, you can also go for the other resistances. Now, I think that getting Chaos Resistance Fractured is actually probably going to end up being cheaper than spamming enough essences to get the Chaos Res, but it sort of just depends on the price of the Fractured base. So let's say we are going to start with, Fractured Chaos Res. It doesn't have to be T1. And then what we're going to do is we're very simply going to spam essences of Loathing for avoid elemental ailments. Again, you only need the second tier of the essence. You don't need deafening. You can use shrieking just fine. And if you intend to get a little bit higher on the implicit from the Eldritch, obviously that's something you can think of based on the price of the essences versus the price of the Eldritch currency. It might even be cheaper to just use screaming essences of loathing and then just get T3 on the implicit. Up to you. But we're just going to go ahead and spam these until we get another suffix that we're happy with, which is probably going to be resistance is what we're going to be aiming after for the most part. So probably something like a T2 and I'd be pretty happy. There we go. T1 fire res. Perfect. All I need is an open prefix. I got one. Very nice. All I can do now is go ahead and craft on the prefix. Suffixes cannot be changed. And then all I need to do is very easily use a Veiled Chaos Orb. Now, most of the time, it's not going to give you any other stats. With it, sometimes it does. Like in this case, I got life, which is pretty much worst case scenario. That's pretty much the only thing that if I got this, I would actually try again because this means that I can't craft life after the fact. But there we go. As you can see, most of the time you're not going to get any other prefix. Once you have the veiled prefix, we're just going to craft on mana because that means that we can't unveil it. And then we're going to go ahead and unveil, and we are looking for any of the move speed. It can be move speed, cannot be chilled. It can move speed if you haven't been hit recently. And it could also be move speed, onslaught, on kill. Doesn't matter. As long as there's move speed on there. And then we're going to finish off the craft very simply by crafting on life. And that would be triple perfect suffixes, GG prefix, and then crafted life, which is just barely any worse than if you were to get the T1 life, right? T1 goes up to like 89. This goes up to 70, and you don't need to divine it either. So that would be a very, very solid pair of boots. And then I would focus on doing the implicits. which in the case, what I went for is action speed. This is basically going to replace the need for Tailwind Onslaught boots that we used to get, the elevated Tailwind with elevated Onslaught from Redeemer and Hunter's boots. These are significantly cheaper, and they're actually not that much worse in terms of the amount of attack speed that you get from them. And matter of fact, I would argue that they're better because they allow you to get the avoid ailments. They allow you to also get cooldown recovery, which saves some nodes on the tree. So even though it's not quite as much attack speed that you get compared to the old elevated Tailwind boots, I would say that these are quite a bit better. And Jesus, significantly cheaper. So obviously for the implicits, you go for the rarest one, which in this case is going to be action speed, I believe. And then you do the little trick where you have to elevate it until you're happy with it. I believe action speed goes up to 6%. I just put 4% because I thought, it's a pretty easy thing to get, but it's up to you how far you want to push it. All right, next, let's go ahead and talk about the amulet. Now, the amulet is going to absolutely require you to get dexterity on it, unless you get dexterity on the boots, right? So if you have a pair of boots that has, say, fractured T1 dexterity because it's a hybrid armor evasion pair of boots or something like that, then you're not going to need the dexterity. Instead, you'll need whatever resistance you don't have on your boots, you'll need that on your amulet. So in the end, basically the boots and the amulets are completely, they're complementing each other, and with like whatever you don't have on one, you'll absolutely need on the other in terms of either the resistance or the dexterity if you want your build to be basically completely balanced out. All right, so the amulet's actually a pretty easy craft. We're basically going to go for either that dexterity roll or the resistance, whatever we're missing. Then the mandatory stats are going to be crit multi and chaos resistance. And then, of course, the life and the minus mana cost. The physical damage to attacks that you see on this amulet is not mandatory. It does add a nice little chunk of damage, but it also is going to significantly increase the cost of making this amulet. Now, so that's going to be up to you whether you want to push for it or not. To put it in perspective, if you were to remove it, you would be losing about 6% damage on the build if you did not have any flat physical damage. So, of course, 6% on a build doing, millions and millions of damage is a pretty big deal, right? Like, if you look at the endgame setup here, how much damage is that? Yeah, 6% of 230 million. It's a lot of millions of damage. You're losing 12.3 million damage from not having this one modifier on your amulet, but it does come down at the end of the day to your budget. So once again, it's going to be exactly like the boots. We're going to start off with a fractured modifier. Now, essentially the fractured modifier is going to be, I would recommend chaos resistance because we can force on crit multi via an essence, or you could also go for the modifier that you're missing from your boots. So in this case, for example, it would be dexterity. However, chaos resistance has a much lower weighting than dexterity. So when you're spamming essences for the missing modifier, if you have fractured chaos resistance, it's going to be pretty easy to get dexterity. It's going to be a lot harder to get a very good tier of chaos resistance. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to go ahead and restart this craft. We're going to go ahead and make an amulet. It's going to be, what I would recommend is either onyx or turquoise, because again, we need a lot of dexterity and we also need intelligence. Intelligence is for some of our support gems. I think we need 111, so it's kind of important that we get some intelligence, but I do believe that an onyx amulet would be good enough. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start off with a fractured suffix. I would probably go for chaos res. I think it's the one that's annoying to get, so I would be happy with that. And then once I have my chaos res fractured, I would simply go to my essences, and they're called Essence of Scorn. They're going to guarantee crit multi, and I would spam the Essence of Scorn until I get the modifier that I'm missing. So that would be either dexterity or resistances for the most part. So I would just go ahead and do that. I think I just skipped over T2 cold res. All right. So it doesn't really matter like how much it is. It's going to depend on your build. But as you can see here, for example, I got T2 dexterity, I got my chaos res, got the crit multi. I'm very happy about this. Essentially, the hard, like not quite the hard part, but like most of the amulet is almost completely done already. Next, as you can see, what we're going to be missing is the prefixes. So Fizz 2 attacks, and then life, and then the minus mana cost on the bench. And if you want to go super budget, you can just completely skip out the physical damage entirely. So that's going to be up to you. If you do want to go for an endgame one with a physical damage to attacks, we're going to go to our prefix, and we're going to go ahead and craft on, once again, suffixes cannot be changed, and then we're going to reforge Fizz. So we're going to go to Harvest, and we're going to reforge Physical. Now, what you need to understand, though, about this is that you need, when you reforge Fizz, you need it to have no other prefixes. And there's a 10% chance that it fills your prefixes, which means you're going to need to go for an annul to get rid of one of the prefixes. And if you annul one of your suffixes, you got to go back to spamming essences. It's not like insanely expensive, but it can add up if you get super unlucky. So that's why this step right here adds a lot of cost, but it is up to you if you want to go for perfect. As you can see here, I got the T1 physical damage to attacks, I got my perfect suffixes, and then I've got nothing else. Like, this is basically, you know, A1. This is the absolute best case scenario. Now what we got to do is suffixes cannot be changed, and then once again, just like the boots, we're going to hit it with, or not the boots, we're going to hit it with an Ashling, 50%, or just like the chess piece. Hit it with an Ashling, 50% chance to kill or Fizz. Now this could be very expensive to get it again, or 50% chance to hit the suffixes cannot be changed. In this case, I hit the Fizz. That would be you know, restart, basically reforge. Because if you hit the Fizz, if you hit the suffixes cannot be changed, this is basically GG, right? You're good to go. But if you hit the Fizz, your suffixes cannot be changed, it's still going to be there, so you can go right back to reforging Physical to get it back. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that until we successfully do so. Now, once we have the prefix, we're going to go ahead and craft on Mana. That's going to be our block. And then we're going to unveil for life, right? Now, that's another thing that can be quite expensive. It's not guaranteed, right? Life is absolutely not guaranteed here. Now, in this case, I did get it. You could get melee damage. The problem is the life, even though it's not a ton of life, it also comes with flat mana per second, and that is important. As you can see on the super endgame version of the build, I only have 12 unreserved mana. That's it. And my mana cost is 9. So if I'm not regenning a lot of flat mana per second, I'm going to be in trouble, which is why I actually really prioritize getting the flat mana regen per second on the unveils for the amulet and the jewelry in general, because it's going to give me, as you can see, a ton of flat mana regen per second. 35 flat per second is a lot. So if I don't have the life, I would essentially need to go again, right? You'd need to annul whatever you just got on your unveil, and of course, if you annul the Fizz, you got to go back to that, and if you annul one of your suffixes, you got to go back to essences. So that's where, as I previously mentioned, the price can very easily go up and up and up and very quickly. But in this case, I got my life, so I'm happy about that. And then I've got my Fizz, so all I need to do is finish off the craft with minus mana cost, right? Whatever channeling or non-channeling is required on the build. And then that is going to be my endgame GG amulet. This is like, it doesn't really get better than this, if you will. There are people that you'll see building with Warlord amulets with, say, the reservation efficiency for Pride. But personally, I actually like this better. I think it's a more well-rounded amulet. It's going to basically cover a lot of weaknesses, and it's also significantly cheaper than trying to go for the Pride RMR, which is not even really necessary at all. Okay, so that's it for the amulet. The rings, you'll see, are extremely similar to what I just explained. However, because they are synthesized rings, we cannot actually, we're not going to be able to fracture them, so we're going to have to start from scratch. So these, the way I would personally recommend doing them is, first off, we're going to go ahead and craft a ring. It's not going to have any influence. The base doesn't matter because it's going to be synthesized. What we're going to want to do is we are going to want to use the Essence of Scorn once again, because it's going to guarantee us crit multi. So we're going to do that. And then once we use Essence of Scorn, what I would personally do is I would spam until I get any of either cold, fire, or lightning resistance of a high tier with an open suffix. So I would go ahead and do that. So let's say, for example, I got something like this without the dexterity, right? T2 cold res and T1 multi. I'm pretty happy about this. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to my prefixes, and I'm going to do suffixes cannot be changed. And then I'm going to reforge chaos. The thing is, there is only one single chaos affix on rings, and that is chaos resistance, nothing else. So when I reforge chaos, I'm absolutely guaranteed to get chaos resistance. Now, I'm not guaranteed to get a good tier of chaos resistance, but I'm guaranteed chaos resistance. So this can get expensive once again if you get unlucky with getting a good tier of chaos resistance. It all comes down to what you're willing to accept. Are you willing to accept a T2 resistance? Are you willing to accept like T2 or even T3 chaos resistance? It's up to you. But that's essentially going to be the suffixes done. Essence into one of the resistance that we're missing, and we can always change this with harvest, right? And then reforge chaos for the chaos resistance until you're happy. Your suffixes are now done. The prefixes is actually the exact same thing. Then with the amulet, there's going to be two different options. You can go for the budget option or you can go for the expensive option. The budget option is very simple. We're going to go ahead and do suffixes cannot be changed, and we're going to hit it with a veiled chaos orb. Now, most of the time, this is not going to come with anything else. Even if it did, it would be fine as long as we have one open prefix. The one open prefix is required to craft on the minus mana cost, but the final prefix doesn't even matter if we're going for the budget option. So as you can see here, we have a veiled prefix. What we'll do is we will craft on mana on the bench, and then we're going to unveil for life and the life and the mana regen flat, and then we're going to finish off the craft with, as always, the minus mana cost, right? And that would be our endgame ring. As you can see, this is exactly what I have here. Multi, res, chaos res, life, and then non-channeling. And then the other one is like channeling or whatever, right? The difference, and by the way, these rings are exactly the same. You can see this one is also crit multi, res, right? Chaos res, life, minus mana cost. The difference is if you wanted to go for an endgame ring, like a GG one, instead of going for the veiled chaos orb, right? Once you get to this point where you have your suffixes cannot be changed with your 3 suffixes, is you would do like the amulet, you would actually reforge physical. And then reforging physical is not going to guarantee you flat physical to attacks, I believe. You can also get like a leech, mana leech, and life leech or something. So it's not even a guarantee. And then, of course, every single time that you reforge, there's a chance that you end up filling your prefixes, which means you have to go for an annul, but we already know that at this point. But yeah, it's not guaranteed to give you some flat physical to attacks. But if you do get it, right, if you're going for a true GG endgame amulet, that is something that would be, an extra little bit of damage. If I go ahead and throw in this, throw in the fizz on this ring, you'll see just how big of a deal that is. So as you can see, T1 physical damage to attacks on a ring like this would be roughly 3% more damage. So it's not quite as big as the amulet, which was 6% more damage, right, for the single modifier. On the rings, it's only about 3%. It's about half. And then, of course, if you have it on both rings, it's going to add up to that 6% more damage. And again, when we're talking about numbers like 200 plus million damage, if you were to get it on both rings, that's 6% of like over 230 million. It does start being a good chunk of damage, but it also is going to add a lot to the cost. But that is essentially how you would craft the rings to have fully GG rings. Now, the end result of all of those things is that you would end up with having around 80 max res, because you get max res here, you get max res here, you get max res here. Then you would also have complete ailment immunity, right? So no brittle, no scorch, no ignite, nothing like that, which is really good for farming simulacrums, but also just in general, right? Can't be frozen, can't be chilled. You don't need flasks, stuff like that. Super, super nice. Then you also would get a lot of chaos res by crafting it like this, right? With the fractured boots and the fractured amulet, and then the reforged chaos on the ring. It's basically guaranteeing you chaos across 4 different slots, which means it's very easy to completely cap out your chaos resistance, which is definitely a problem for most builds, right? Having like negative 60 chaos res means that you're going to have a really hard time. So this makes it so you can completely cap out your chaos res. You can see I have a max chaos hit of 70,000, which is like a lot. And then also, you're going to have a decent amount of life, decent amount of mana regen from all of the unveils of flat mana regen paired with a Lyra mana regen. And yeah, that's pretty much how you would go about crafting all of that. The body armor is going to help a lot with the additional curse, because it's going to mean that you can run a damaging curse on top of your defensive curse on Asenath, right? Asenath has Temporal Chain, which is a defensive mechanic. But then if you have +1 curse, you can also apply the vulnerability on the gloves from the corruption. And that's going to be a good chunk of damage, especially now with the curse changes. That's going to be a lot more damage than what we had even before. And on the pure DPS setup, it's even a bigger deal because you get vulnerability on the curse, but you also get Assassin's Mark. So that +1 curse is going to make it so you don't have just one additional damaging curse. You have an additional damaging curse and another additional damaging mark, which is Assassin's Mark, which is going to be pretty insane because this build has a pretty hard time getting a lot of crit. If you go to like a more budget version, so if I go to like Paradoxica with no Asenats, you'll see that my crit chance is pretty low, right? It's not even that bad, but like 70%. However, with Asenats, because of course without Asenats we're getting the Oscar Assassin's Mark, but without with Asenats, which is what I would recommend, we're only at like 60% crit. Now, of course, this is without Flask, so if I throw in a Diamond Flask, it'll become a little bit better, but still like 76% crit. It's not that good. And we are a crit build, right? We have like over 400 multi, and then the endgame setup has like over 500 multi. So that's why this base crit is such a big deal on the body armor. But essentially, that's the video on how to craft every single one of the pieces of the gear on the PoB. Again, if there's anything that you may have missed or that you think you might want to check out again, use the timestamps to see which specific crafts you're interested in learning how to do. And otherwise, that'll be Matthew signing out. Until next one. Peace.